Today's aim is that Kipsters will be able to explain what happens when you divide by 0. And the way that we're going to go about this is I'm actually going to treat you like some high school students, because we're going to actually learn something that I learned when I was in 11th grade. It's a concept called limits. And I'm going to guide you through it a little bit more than I was guided through it when I was in 11th grade. But we're going to use this concept of limits to help us understand what happens when we divide by 0. We're going to make sure also today that we understand there's a big difference between these two things, 0 divided by 4, and, let's just be more general than that, 0 divided by 2 and 2 divided by 0. So these are two very different things. One of them we already know everything there is to know, and that's 0 divided by 2. What is 0 divided by 2? What is 0 divided by any number? 0. We know that. So the question for today is, what is 2 divided by 0? Okay? We're going to try and figure that out, and we're going to spend some time today. And the way that we're going to do this is all based on the idea of if we start graphing numbers as they get closer and closer. So for instance, if I have y is equal to x, this would be basically x divided by 2. Say that's what we're talking about. This is going to tell us what happens as we divide any number by 2. And what we can see is that if we're trying to figure out what happens when we divide 0 by 2, we can take this idea of being like, okay, well, this is showing me that as I get closer and closer to dividing by 0, I'm getting very close to 0. If I'm getting closer and closer to 0 and I'm coming from this direction, I'm closer to 0. So this proves to us that 0 divided by 2 is 0. Okay? So what we're doing today is we're going to do the same concept, but it's going to be a lot more complicated when we're trying to figure out what happens when we divide 1 by 0. So we're going to take a whole bunch of numbers and we're going to get closer and closer to dividing it by 0, and we're just going to see where that leads us. And we're going to use those leads to help us determine what happens when you divide by 0. This concept is called limits. And so basically what we're doing here is, in terms of calculus, we would call this the limit as x approaches 0 from the negative side. And so what we're doing here is we're just getting x closer and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to 0, and we're going to see what happens when we are dividing something by x. And we're going to do the same thing coming from the positive side. So the way that we would write this in calculus is we'd be writing the limit as x approaches 0 from the positive side. What happens when we divide by x as it gets closer and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to 0. Okay? All right? So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to actually calculate out this value for every x. So the first x is negative 10. So I'm going to plug in 1 over negative 10. I already see that's a bad date. That's going to give me a negative answer. I'm going to put the top dog in the house. My decimal pops straight up. I need to haunt the house because 10 doesn't go into 1. 10 goes into 10 one time. So I get negative 0.1. And I'm going to continue down the line. I'm going to do 1 divided by negative 1. Well, this should be a really easy one for us. 1 divided by negative 1 is actually just negative 1. Then I'm going to move on. I'm going to try the next one. 1 divided by negative 0.5. So I'm going to put the 1 in the house and divide by negative 0.5. Again, I know that's going to give me a negative answer because it's a bad date. Move the decimal one time, move the decimal one time. 5 goes into 1 0 times. 5 goes into 10 2 times. I run out of space, so it looks like my answer is negative 2. And I want you to keep going. And what you're thinking about as you're doing this is you're thinking about what's happening as I'm getting closer and closer to 0. Coming from the positive side. And then what's happening as I'm getting closer and closer to 0? Coming from the positive side. So we're thinking about what those limits are. What it is when we're getting closer and closer to 0. And hopefully that should give us an idea maybe about what would happen if we actually divided by 0. We'll make some ideas. Okay, so go ahead and work through this. Feel free to check in with your partner's work to double check that your division is appropriate. So let's keep moving down the line with some people who already have these calculations done. So for this one, it was 1 divided by negative 0.1. What was the 1 divided by negative 0.1? Charles? Negative 10. What was the negative 1, or what was the 1 divided by the negative 0.05 as we keep coming down? Felipe? Negative 20. And what was the 1 divided by the negative 0.001? Isaias? I should not hear your voices. So really quickly, let's double check this. I have 1 divided by 0.001. 1, 2, 3 times I move the decimal place. 1, 2, 3 times I move the decimal place. So 1 goes into 1 one time. Thinking again about my columns. I have 3 columns that I need to fill in here. It looks like this should be 1,000, negative 1,000. The 0.05. 1, 2 times. Again, thinking about my columns. Move the decimal 1, 2 times. My decimal should be here. 0.5 goes in 2 times. 0, negative 20. Yes, Isaac. Question? Okay. So that's what happens when we approach from the negative side. So tell me, what is the limit as x approaches 0 from the negative side of 1 over x? In other words, what happens if we're coming from the negative side and we're getting closer and closer to dividing by 0? Somebody tell me, what happens as we approach and we get closer and closer to dividing by 0 from the negative side? It gets more and more negative. You're saying the numbers are getting smaller. The absolute value is getting larger, but it's getting more and more and more negative. So actually, if we graph this, it will give us a visual way to think about it. And this is really going to be just a sketch because we're not going to be very precise here. Our first x was negative 10, so I'll just put negative 10 out here. And that would probably make this about negative 1, which was our second one. Make that negative 1, negative 10. And so our first point would be negative 10.1. So that's going to be negative 10, and this is going to be really close to 0. Second point, negative 1, negative 1. Our third point would be negative 0.5, so that would be somewhere in between, and it's negative 2, so that's probably going to be about right here. Next point is negative 0.1. That's going to be really close to 0, coming up here to 10. And we can see as we get closer and closer to 0, closer and closer to this line, we're going to get these larger and larger numbers. And so this is going to look like, as we're getting closer and closer to 0, that this is happening. So this is exactly what James described. It's just a visual way of representing it. You should have this sketch on your paper. Yours does not need to be nearly as large because you probably took up more of that space. So what this shows us is that as we get closer and closer to 0, we get these more and more and more negative numbers. So again, that's what we call the limit as x approaches 0 from the negative side of dividing by x. So as we're getting closer and closer to dividing by 0, this is what's happening. It's getting down to these more and more negative numbers. We're going to call this negative infinity. Infinity is this idea that we can make larger and larger and larger and larger numbers forever and ever and ever and ever, and we're never going to run out of ways to make larger numbers. So this is going to keep giving us larger and larger numbers forever. Sorry, more and more and more negative numbers forever. So what happens if we're coming in from the positive side? Well, that's what our chart over here tells us. If I had 1 divided by 10, what did I get? Down here, 1 divided by 10. What did I get? Yoel? 0.1. If I had 1 divided by 1, what did I get?
1.
Thank you for raising your hand. If I got 1 divided by 0.5, what did I get? 5. Karen?
2.
If I have 1 divided by 0.1, what did I get? Esmeralda? Wrong class. Sorry. I'm just throwing out names that I know I want to call on. Wrong class, though. Silali, what did I get? 10 by 0.05. Alejandro? 0.01. Kenneth? 0.001. Najari? Jalela? 1,000. So, this is where we start thinking. Now, without putting the visual on there, what is happening as we get closer and closer to 0 coming from the positive side? Getting closer and closer to dividing by 0 coming from the positive side. What happens? Michael? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We get these more and more and more in positive values. If we start to graph that, it looks pretty much the same as the other way, except now instead of moving to beginning more and more negative, it is getting more and more positive until it reaches up to positive infinity. It's going to go on to these infinitely large numbers. More and more and more and more positive numbers until we just get tired and we say, all right, it's going to keep going on. I get it. Now, here's the question. Remember, our aim for today is to figure out what happens when we actually get to 0? Based on the trends that you see, think very carefully. What do you think is going to happen if we divide by 0? Going back to this idea that when we looked at it over here, when we divided 0 by something, we figured that out because the arrows coming from both directions pointed to the same place. What do we think the value of 1 divided by x is going to be? This is where I'm asking you to take a chance. I will accept many different answers here. I want you to think and use your brain and be able to describe why you think what you think. Isaias, what do you think?
0.
Why 0?
Because on that one did the diagram, when it turns to go down, and when that one turns to go up, they share the vortex of 0.
Okay, so he's saying that he thinks perhaps it would be 0. And my pushback on that is neither of those arrows, whether I'm coming from the positive side or I'm coming from the negative side, seems to suggest that we would end up there in the middle. Not saying he's wrong yet, though. Other ideas? Isaac.
I have a question. So, can it be 0.00 forever, 1, and then it'll still be 0?
So if
Like right there,
Isaac is asking, if I divide by something that's like 0.00001, what do you think I'm going to get? Yoel is saying 10,000. He's saying we're adding on more and more zeros. So that number is going to keep getting larger and larger and larger as we get closer and closer to 0. That's what we have represented by our graph up here. It's just going to keep getting larger and larger and larger. So I need some other ideas here. What do we think it might happen when we divide by 0? What do these trends seem to suggest? Isaias right now is the only person who has gone out on a limb to take a guess based on what he's seen. Michael, what do you think?
What was the question you said?
Yoel, what do you think?
Keep on adding zeros.
So it's going to be what?
Like 1 million and like 1.
So what would it be when I actually divide it by 0? Because you're telling me that it's going to...
Oh, it's gonna stay the same.
It's going to stay the same? How?
Because 0.
When I say 1 divided by 0, what am I going to put down as my answer?
1.
So 1, that would be here. 0 would be here. So if we only looked at the left side of this graph and we said, all right, well, this is getting closer and closer to 0, what would you tell me? All right, Mr. Boots, this is getting closer and closer to 0. I see what happens. It goes down to negative infinity. So I would be totally accepting of you to tell me that, you know what, Mr. Boots, I think the answer is when you get 1 divided by 0, the answer is going to be negative infinity.
Wait.
This infinitely negative number. Yoel.
So if you divide by 0, it's gonna be like, so its pound rule is like negative, like infinity,
All right, so Yoel is saying, if I'm coming from the positive side, though, Mr. Boots, and I look at this, you're telling me that it's going to be an infinitely positive number. So the question is, what's the real answer? What happens? Well, over here we were able to say that we knew that 0 divided by 2 gave me 0 because they both converged. No matter what direction we were coming from, they converged in the same place. Well, here, depending on which direction we're coming from, they end up in different places. In math, this is what we call being undefined. We say that this is undefined. That the answer to when we divide something by 0 is undefined. And the reason it's undefined, and this is part of your aim for today. So what is the value when you divide by 0? It is undefined because if you come from positive, here you may need to bleed over to the other side of your paper or write this even completely somewhere else and just point it over here. If you come from positive, you get a positive infinity. But if you come from negative, you get negative infinity. They don't converge. So anytime that we're talking about mathematically, when things don't converge, we consider that undefined. Yes, ma'am.
Every time, like when, like the undefined, every time it's like that, is it always undefined, or if you like, is it always undefined?
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter what we're dividing by. If I was dividing 4 by numbers that are getting closer and closer to 0, I would see the same pattern. The curve would just look slightly different. So no matter what we do, whenever we divide something by 0, it's undefined. Because it's going to create this idea that we have no idea which direction it's coming from. Not to mention that when we want to use it mathematically, even if we knew it was infinite or negatively infinite, we wouldn't be able to add to that anyway. So when we see this within our work, we're immediately going to stop and say, hey, I'm dividing by 0. That means that this answer is undefined. We cannot determine this answer because dividing by 0 is undefined. So you absolutely need to have this written down on your paper. You absolutely need to have this table filled out, and you absolutely need to have a sketch of this graph. Because those are the 3 things that could put together this idea of being able to explain what happens when you divide by 0. It is not going to be just enough today for you to tell me that dividing by 0 is undefined. You need to be able to explain to me how it's undefined or why it's undefined. So please make sure that on your notes right now, you have something that you can reference that pushes you to be able to explain why dividing by 0 is undefined. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to make sure your notes are up to stuff, and then I'm going to ask about 5 of you to describe to me why dividing by 0 is undefined. Destiny, we'll start with you. Why is dividing by 0 undefined? What's up? I want you to describe to me, however you would describe it to somebody on the street, why dividing by 0 is undefined. If I stopped you tomorrow and said, why is dividing by 0 undefined, what would you tell me? There's a lot of different ways to say it, so I'm not looking for one specific way. Destiny, what would you say? Okay, so from one time we would get negative infinity, and the other way we would get positive infinity, so we can't really figure out what it is. That's kind of a more vernacular way of saying it. Absolutely. Michael, what would you say?
I was gonna say because like nothing that it would be able to go either way. It's not an actual number. Well, it's a number, but it's not the value.
Yeah, so there's no known value because as you approach 0 dividing by 0 from the two different directions, there's no clear number that it's going to. That's a slightly different way of saying it. Najari, how would you tell me, how would you explain to somebody or explain to me why dividing by 0 is undefined?
That, it could sometimes be like, undivided.
Sorry, one more time. There was a little bit of distraction. I didn't hear you quite.
It can be sometimes kind of undefined, it can be undefined for,
Blanca, what do you think? How would you describe it? Okay, so I think that probably the most succinct way of describing this is saying, as you divide numbers that are closer and closer to 0, there is no clear definition of where it's going. That's a very succinct way of saying it. I think if somebody were to ask me this question, I probably would get out a piece of paper and I would draw this sketch. That's totally okay too. If you draw this sketch and you just quickly can describe for me what it is, a sketch of, that's enough proof for me as well. Okay? Same thing with this chart. If you were to draw this chart, it would be the same thing. Okay? All right. Please do me a favor. I want you to answer these 3 multiple choice questions on your own. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to get it done. Answer the 3 multiple choice questions. Take 2 minutes to get it done. One more minute. Okay, please check me 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Everybody show me your answer to the first multiple choice question. Everybody should be showing me their answer to the first multiple choice question. Right now I'm still not seeing answers from a handful of people. Okay, what I should be seeing from everybody is after we substitute this in, we have a 4 divided by 0. And we have just proven over and over again that we cannot define, and we just had everybody describe to me why we could not define what happens when you divide by 0. So this should be undefined. And as we look through our answers, that means not 4, not 0, not negative 4. None of the above, because none of the above say undefined. Please show me your answer for the second do now problem. Or not the second do now problem, the second multiple choice problem. Still waiting for a response from about 3 people. Alejandro, that's you. So looking at this, when I plug this in, 4 minus 2 over 2 times 2 minus 2, and I start going through the work, order of operations, 4 minus 2 over 2 times 0 is going to give me 4 minus 2 over 0. Why can I stop here? Why can I stop with my work right here? Isaac.
Could you just subtract 4 and like 2 minus 1?
But why can I stop before I even do that subtraction?
Because there's still work to do.
Why can't I stop right now?
Oh, because we already know that anything divided by 0 is divided by 0.
Right, doesn't matter what we're dividing by 0, we know it's undefined. So there's really no point in doing any further work here. We know that our answer is going to be undefined. It doesn't matter what part of our work is undefined, that's going to make the entire problem undefined. So even if I had this and I was supposed to add 2,000 to it, it doesn't really matter. Because what's undefined plus 2,000? It's like saying, you don't know what something is, add 2,000. Tell me what you get. Undefined. We don't know. And finally, your answer for the last multiple choice problem. So this one was even easier than the previous one. Negative 4 plus 0 over 0. I don't need to do any work here because I see that we're dividing by 0, which means my answer is undefined. Now, let's really quickly check back with our key points over here. We had that 0 divided by 2 we knew was 0. And we have 2 divided by 0, which we know is now equal to what? Charles? Undefined. Please move on to your together time work.